Hello, I have a question for you. How do you get the central processing unit in this phone to send a signal to the camera to take a picture? Well, wires could be used, but there isn't enough space in this phone for wires. So, what's the solution? The answer is soldering. Soldering joins two electrical connections, like a pin and a circuit board, by melting solder between them, which allows an electrical signal to flow. Solder is just a metal that has a melting point lower than both electrical connections, which allows the solder to melt, but nothing else. Now, to teach you how to solder, I'm going to pass you on to Lincoln.
Soldering follows a basic outline where you set up your tools, selecting the right soldering tip and temperature. You connect the wires you want to solder, you solder those wires, and then you clean up your workspace for the next person. Next, let's talk about the equipment you're going to need in your workspace. At a minimum, you'll need a soldering station, which controls the temperature of the soldering iron. And while this may not look hot, it always could be, so never touch it with your bare hands. You'll also need solder, which will be melted by the soldering iron, flow into the joint you're trying to create, and connect the two wires you're trying to join. Lastly, you'll need a way to clean the soldering iron of excess solder after creating every joint. There are also some more optional pieces of equipment you can use for soldering, such as flux, which helps the solder flow better into the joint, tip tinner, which reduces the oxide layer on the soldering iron, making the solder melt faster, so you can control the heat properties of your soldering joint better. There's also different ways to remove solder joints, such as ones that use vacuums or a soldering wick, which pulls the solder away. Alright, let's talk about choosing the right tip. You want to make sure you're using the correct sized tip for your soldering operation. So look at your soldering joint, look at the selection of tips you have, and make the intuitive choice. Shouldn't be too large. You don't want to use a giant battery to power your Apple Pencil. It would just explode. So, as I said before, when we're replacing the tip and when we're ever interacting with the soldering iron, we want to make sure we're never touching it. It could be hot. It doesn't look hot ever. So, we're going to use gloves, and I also know that this is cold based on the fact that it's been off for a while and it's even unplugged, and I'm still going to use gloves. So I'll go ahead, loosen the retaining ring here, pull that off, pull the old tip off, take my new tip, make sure I get that temperature sensing filament in the center there, slide the ring back on, and put it back in place. And now this one could be hot, so I'll handle this one with gloves. Next, let's go ahead and set up the temperature on the soldering station to set for the soldering iron. We're going to let it boot up here, and it will show you the temperature that the soldering iron is currently at with that temperature filament I showed you earlier when replacing the tip. And now, on most soldering irons, we're going to use the arrow keys to set this temperature here. So let's go ahead and set this around 400 Celsius. You can set it anywhere from 300 to 400. You'll hear a lot of different suggestions. Find what works for you, but generally in that range is good. You let that screen time out after you set that with the arrow keys, and it'll correctly set that temperature. It's climbing up here. And there you see it's at our 400 Celsius that we set.
And you can convert that to Fahrenheit if you want.
Now we're going to show two different types of solder joints between wires and pins on breadboards. Next, I'm going to walk you through how to solder two wires together. So, we're going to start with these wires, take some wire strippers, and remove the insulation from one end of each wire, about 1/2 inch. And to keep this stranded wire tidy when soldering, I'm going to twist the end into a nice twirl here. Now I've already got the other wire here. Before I go ahead and solder, I'm going to twist the wires together as well, and that's going to give a nice connection for the solder to flow into. All right, let's actually solder this wire joint. So we're going to bring over a fume extractor because soldering produces some dangerous fumes that you don't want to breathe in. Gonna power that on, bring it relatively close to the soldering joint. We're gonna pull out our soldering iron at the right temperature, and we're gonna tin the tip. So I'm gonna use that tip tinner, and I'm gonna rub it around and clean off any oxide layer on the tip, which will also improve conductivity. So now I can bring the soldering iron up to the joint, heat it up until solder is able to melt on the joint. The solder will melt, flow into the joint. You can see that smoke going into the fume extractor just as we want. I put the soldering iron back away, let that joint cool down, and there we have a solder joint between two wires. Now that I'm done soldering the joint, I'm gonna go ahead and clean off the tip in this wire mesh, just rubbing it around a little bit, and now the excess solder has been removed from the soldering iron. So if we just left this electrical connection exposed like this, you could even electrocute yourself because you could accidentally touch it. So we're gonna add back that insulation we took off when we used the wire strippers. So I have this small piece of tubing right here that I can slide on to the wire, and it will actually shrink with heat. So I'll use this lighter and I'll shrink it down so it will conform to the size of that soldered joint, and I'll actually flip this around for some more even heating. And there you can see it's reduced in size, and it's not going to come off of the soldered joint there. Now I was lucky because this is just a strand of wire, but you'll want to put the heat shrink tubing on before you create the solder joint so that you can slide it onto the joint if these wires, you can't just use their ends and slide the heat shrink tubing over. Next, I'm going to walk you through how to solder a pin joint. We'll get our fume extractor as always and set it close to our position of soldering. This is a great opportunity to use some flux paste, which will help the solder flow onto the pin joint and make it much easier to solder. So I'm just going to put a very small amount right onto that, barely any at all. That's all that's needed. I'm going to take my soldering iron and some solder here. It's useful to pull some solder out of the spool so that you can just hold the solder on its own. Then I will heat up the pin and apply some solder. And there is a pin joint. Pin joints give us a great opportunity to talk about some of the errors you'll inevitably make when you're first learning to solder. So those three are not putting enough solder on the joint, putting too much solder on the joint, and not heating the joint up enough. Let's show you those. We're going to start with not enough solder, which is simple enough. We just won't add enough solder to the joint. So not adding enough solder is kind of hard to do on these small pin joints, but as you can see, there's a much steeper curve to that solder joint than the other one. I'll try again to put even less. Looks like nothing's there. There, that's a perfect example of not quite enough solder. It looks like those connections are bridged, but any small vibrations could break those connections. Next up, putting too much solder. For that, I'm gonna actually use large solder, so it's really easy to just go ham and add way too much solder. And you'll see very quickly what this can do is it's gonna look very bulbous compared to all the other solder joints. But what this can lead to, and I'm trying to get it to happen, is if you just touch another solder joint like that, you'll bridge between the two pins, making an electrical connection that might mess something up. So that's a serious risk with too much solder. Next is not enough heat. So for this, we're gonna have to cool down the soldering iron. To show you not enough heat going into a solder joint, I actually had to turn down the temperature of the soldering station, controlling the soldering iron. And we're going to see what that looks like as I try to create this soldering joint. I go to add the solder, and it barely sticks on, and you get these little wisps of solder that appear right above where you're trying to solder. Make sure you clean up after yourself, so the next person doesn't have such a bad time. And remember, the soldering iron could still be hot, so don't pick it up by the tip.
Before you go, a few quick reminders. We haven't covered every aspect of soldering, so we've linked some further resources in the description below. If you have any further questions, we highly recommend you check out those resources. And if you're unsure about